You are watching DHTV from California State University, Dominguez Hills.
And in Chicago, on Memorial Day of 1937, a strike at Republic Steel is going to bring out the police, and they're going to fire at a mass picket line of strikers, killing 10 of them. The incident took place in what was called the Little Steel Strike. And today in labor history, it is known as the 1937 Memorial Day Massacre. The incident arose after U.S. Steel signed a union contract, but smaller steel manufacturers like Little Steel, including Republic Steel, refused to do so. And in protest, the Steel Workers Organizing Committee of the Congress of Industrial Organizations called a strike. So on Memorial Day, hundreds of sympathizers gathered at Sam's Place headquarters of the Steel Workers Organizing Committee. And as the crowd marched across the prairie towards the Republic Steel Mill, a line of Chicago policemen blocked their path. And when the foremost protesters argued their right to continue, a tree branch was tossed at the police lines and the police fired on the crowd. And as the crowd fled, police bullets killed 10 people and injured 30. 9 people were permanently disabled and another 28 had serious head injuries from police clubbings. No police were ever prosecuted. The coroner's jury declared the killings to be quote-unquote justifiable homicide. And the press mostly called it a labor riot or a communist riot. And ultimately 50 people were shot, of whom 10 later died. And 100 others were beaten with clubs. And those that died were shot in the back as they fled the police attack. Now let's go take a look at a documentary that was produced by the Illinois Labor History Society back in the 1950s as they're attempting to understand this massacre.
A view of the Millgate entrance at 118th and Burley, showing evidently some police, some scabs, some company personnel in the background. General view of the South Chicago plant of Republic Steel Corporation. And some of our pickets marching in front of the plant gate. A very limited number, as you can see.
Sam, that's such a shocking film. There must have been a real public outcry.
There was, but at the same time, this film that you've just seen was suppressed by the police. The public press, that is the newspapers, tended to support the Chicago police. They looked upon it as a demonstration that warranted the bloodshed by the Chicago police. However, we had had some similar incidents on the evening of the 26th and the 28th of May at the Republic Steel plant in South Chicago, where, again, our pickets had been beaten by police billy clubs, and we were anticipating that they might do that same thing today. That's the reason, for example, you saw in there some of the cars with a Red Cross sign on it were there to help carry any injured who may have been beaten. However, none of them really anticipated any serious incident or any shooting as took place. Consequently, the whole thing was a real tragedy. When the police had their grand jury investigation by the coroner's committee, they marked it down as justifiable homicide. The police alleged that our members were under the influence of marijuana, and that because they had marched across the field that day chanting CIO, CIO, that this was an indication that they were under the influence of dope.
This film shows so much police brutality, it's hard to believe that it would occur like this there before your eyes.
Yes, I think if you examine the film very carefully as it's being shown, you can see many of the police with drawn guns firing. You can see the strikers running away from the police line, trying to avoid being injured or hit by the police.
Tell me something about the people who were killed. Were they Republic Steel strikers?
Well, it's interesting, Les, to remember that of the 10 that were killed, there was Leo Francisco, a Mexican, Anthony Taglieri, an Italian, Lee Tisdale, a black, Joe Rothman, who was born in Bavaria in Germany, Sam Popovich, I assume, is a Croatian, Alfred Causey, who came from Alabama, Kenneth Reed, a farm boy from Iowa. There were 30 other victims of gunshot wounds, and there were 60 others who were clubbed or beaten.
Well, you mentioned that lady from Hull House.
Yes.
What was her testimony again that,
Mrs. Marshall, Lupe Marshall, testified that when she was thrown into the paddy wagon and to be hauled to the police station, that they were normally you accommodate 8 passengers in the paddy wagon. She counted 16. Many of them were thrown in on the floor between the seats, and they were piled on top of each other, wounded, bleeding. And she testified before the Senate Investigating Committee that one of them down at the bottom of the pile, who was very visibly in very bad condition, asked for a cigarette. She lit a cigarette and put it in his mouth. It fell out of his mouth. "Thank you, that's all right," he said. And she said his eyes glazed and she could tell that he was dying right then and there.
well, you said that the film was suppressed. What do you mean by that?
It was suppressed by the police. The Senate Investigating Committee had to subpoena it in order to have it appear before the La Follette Committee, who conducted an investigation of the Memorial Day incident.
Well, then this really must have been prime evidence in that hearing.
It was, and the Senate Committee also indicated very clearly that the long white clubs that were used by the police, the tear gas that was used by the police, evidently had to come from the properties of Republic Steel Corporation.
How did they get to that conclusion?
There was no tear gas issued by the regular police department that day,
Ah.
and anyone can see very clearly that these were not regulation police billy clubs. As a matter of fact, the police had been housed, fed, clothed, and billeted inside the plant gates by the Republic Steel Company, and the police had been there even before the strike had began.
What about the strike itself?
Well, we, for all practical results, lost the strike, and it took us 4 or 5 years before we achieved our first collective bargaining agreement with the little steel companies.
So you did make a comeback.
Oh, we did make a comeback. We did not stop fighting. We fought to maintain the union and to conduct local union meetings and continue to organize and to use all of the available legal means that were present to finally vindicate the position of the right of the American working men and women to have a legitimate, bona fide trade union of their own choosing. Our union wasn't handed to us on a silver platter. We had to fight for it every inch of the way. That there were a lot of blood, sweat, and tears that went into the building of this organization. And that as long as we have laws that govern the relationship between the employer and the members of the union, we must constantly be on the alert to protect those rights. The right of freedom to speech, freedom of assembly, the right to peacefully picket. And there's one adage we should always remember: those who forget the past are destined to relive it.
All right, welcome students to the folks who brought us the weekend. Of course, here we are working on the weekend, but nonetheless, we're losing our weekends, but welcome. A Mexican, an Italian, a black, a Bavarian, a Croatian, an Alabaman, a Southerner, a Midwestern farmer. They died in that massacre. They died so that we might have it a little bit better today. An 8-hour day, can you imagine that? Overtime pay, can you imagine that? Social Security, can you imagine that? Workers' compensation. They died so that we could have a little bit better life. They died so that we could have a weekend. We must honor them. That is the 1937 Memorial Day Massacre. Now, they fought for something larger than themselves, and there's a woman that's very important, an immigrant woman. Her name is Luisa Moreno. She was a leader in the United States labor movement. She was a social activist, and she was a Guatemalan. She unionized workers, led strikes, wrote pamphlets in English and Spanish, convened the 1939 Congreso de Pueblos de Habla Española, which was the first national Latino civil rights assembly. Before she was voluntarily returned to Guatemala in 1915 after being pressured by the House Un-American Activities Committee to leave this country. She will be deported. As the Great Depression struck in 1929, and in order to support her daughter and unemployed husband, Moreno worked as a seamstress in Spanish Harlem. She organized her co-workers, most of whom were Latinas, into a garment workers' union. And in 1935, Moreno was hired by the American Federation of Labor as a professional organizer. She left her abusive husband and settled with her daughter in Florida, where she unionized African American and Latina cigar rollers. She joined the Congress of Industrial Organizations, and she became a representative of what was known as UCAPAWA, the United Cannery, Agricultural, Packing, and Allied Workers of America. She became the editor of its Spanish-language newspaper in 1940. So as an UCAPAWA representative, she helped organize workers at pecan shelling plants in San Antonio, Texas, and at cannery workers here in Los Angeles. There she encouraged alliances between workers at different plants. And her leadership was the type that empowered other workers, especially women, and she strongly encouraged women to take leadership roles in union organizations. And during the 1950s, under the second Red Scare known as McCarthyism, Luisa Moreno will be deported to Guatemala for being, quote unquote, a communist sympathizer. And then there's another woman who put her life on the line larger than herself because she was involved in her community and wanted her community to have social justice and economic equality. And her name was Emma Tenayuca. She was a labor organizer to farm workers in San Antonio, Texas in the 1930s and beyond, and she led Mexican workers' movements in Texas. Tenayuca's first knowledge of the struggle of working people came from visits as a young child to what was known as the Plaza del Zacate in San Antonio. This was a place where socialists and anarchists would come to speak and work with families with grievances. She was an integral part of the historical struggle to incorporate Mexican workers into progressive U.S. trade unions at a time when the overwhelming majority of Mexican workers were employed in low-paying, low-status sectors of the economy. And Tenayuca was also instrumental in one of the most famous conflicts of Texas labor history, the 1938 strike at the Southern Pecan Shelling Company. And during the strike, thousands of workers at over 130 plants protested a wage reduction of 1 cent per pound of shelled pecans. Mexicana and Chicana workers who picketed were gassed, arrested, and jailed. And the strike ended after 37 days when the city pecan growers agreed to arbitration. And in October that year, the National Labor Relations Act raised wages to 25 cents an hour. Thousands lost their jobs the following years as operators decided to mechanize plants in the face of rising labor costs. But let's take a look at how the Chicano Studies Center at the University of Texas at San Antonio, especially the women of Mecha, honored her in this documentary.
On a hot August night in 1939, San Antonio experienced the worst civil unrest in its history. A mob of 5,000 people converged on the municipal auditorium. Their purpose was to attack a group of Communist Party members meeting inside. But the focus of their anger was a slender young labor organizer and Communist Party leader named Emma Tenayuca. When they couldn't find her, they turned their anger on the seats and the windows and whatever else they could destroy. And in the days that followed, they frequently threatened to kill her. The woman who aroused such passions was raised on the west side of San Antonio by her grandparents. Her grandfather taught her to fish in the San Antonio River.
She was one of 11 children. She and her younger sister, my Aunt Carrie, went to live with the grandparents, her maternal grandparents. And I know that her grandfather really nurtured her. He really nurtured her intellect. I think they would curl up in a chair and read the newspaper and, you know, look at the pictures and talk about what was going on, things like that.
On trips to the Plaza del Zacate, now known as Milam Square, Emma's grandfather introduced her to the intoxicating world of political ideology. By the time she was 15, Emma was reading works by Karl Marx and such intellectuals of the Mexican Revolution as the Flores Magón brothers. By the time she was 17, She had been jailed for walking the picket line with workers striking against the Fink Cigar Company. By the time she was 21, Emma Tenayuca was known throughout San Antonio for her passionate support of better wages and working conditions for the city's laborers. She was a gifted orator and skilled union organizer, and her name was becoming anathema to the political establishment. All the elements were in place for her greatest confrontation. Since the late 19th century, pecan shelling had become one of San Antonio's major industries. 25% of the nation's pecans were processed here, mostly by Hispanic women working in sweatshop conditions at near starvation wages. In January 1938, the shelling companies dropped their payments for a pound of shelled pecan meat from 7 cents to 6 cents. It was the straw that broke the camel's back. 12,000 pecan shellers went on strike. They asked Emma Tenayuca to lead them. Emma was everywhere, writing pamphlets, walking picket lines, giving fiery speeches. But soon, the power structure of the city, spearheaded by the police, descended on the strikers. Hundreds were arrested. Dozens were jailed, including Emma. The strike continued for months, and the strikers eventually won back their original pay. More importantly, they proved that workers had some power.
But I think that she felt that she made a difference with the pecan sheller strike. She spoke of it as a beginning because I think what it did is it gave people hope, and it gave people the knowledge that they could make a difference.
After the strike was settled, Emma continued her efforts for the poor and the unemployed. But her affiliation with the Communist Party set up another confrontation. The one that left her running from a hysterical mob at the municipal auditorium. In a move that cost him his political career, Mayor Maury Maverick allowed the local communists to meet in the municipal auditorium. Maverick felt it was a free speech issue. Unfortunately, some disgruntled citizens didn't see it that way, which is why Emma and other party members had to be hurriedly led to a safety under police escort. After that night, Emma adopted a lower profile. For the next 10 years, she continued to promote workers' rights, but she herself was forced out of the workplace. Shunned by San Antonio's business community, she could not find employment. In 1948, seeking a quieter life and a chance to earn a living, Emma left for California. She would not return for 20 years. When Emma once again took up residence in her native city, she hoped only to enjoy her extended family and settle into a quiet role as a public school teacher. Instead, she found herself honored as a pioneer Chicana, a Hispanic woman who had been ahead of her time as a feminist and civil rights activist. In 1981, she was included in an exhibit of notable Texas women at the Institute of Texan Cultures. In 1986, her achievements were recognized by the San Antonio Women's Hall of Fame, by Our Lady of the Lake University, and by St. Mary's University. In 1990, she appeared on the poster for the National Women's History Month. "You know, there were times when I thought I might be lynched," said Emma, "but I never thought I would be honored."
There was kind of a debt of gratitude among her contemporaries. By that time, the 80s and 90s, we had, thank God, we had minimum wage, we had fair labor standards, we had Social Security, we had food stamps, things like that. So there was a recognition that, yes, we don't let our citizens starve to death. We take care of the workers, our citizens. And so they realized she was really ahead of her time because that's what she was fighting for way back so many years ago.
In a cruel twist of fate, Emma's brilliant mind succumbed to Alzheimer's disease. She died in 1999. But the world she left behind was changed, and Emma Tenayuca had helped change it.
The union makes us strong!
So again, who are these dangerous people? These socialists, these communists, these Reds, these anarchists, these people who just don't seem to get it right that we live in a place that's capitalism. Who are these peoples? These peoples are the ones that are very instrumental in giving us the rights that we so take for granted today in our generation. The right, what this generation left us, an 8-hour day, overtime pay. They brought us the weekend. They got us Social Security. They got us aids to families with dependent children. These peoples put their lives on the line for us. They were immigrants. They were children of immigrants. They come from all the different directions of white, black, yellow, red beans, the green beans. So let's appreciate this generation, students. Again, they were involved in political democracy, and they called not just for political democracy, but also economic democracy, social equality, and an interracial and gender discrimination. So for black people, the New Deal was psychologically encouraging, yet most blacks, along with Mexicans and Asians, were ignored by the New Deal programs. And as tenant farmers, as farm laborers, as migrants, as domestic workers, people of color did not qualify for unemployment insurance, minimum wages, Social Security, or farm subsidies. Roosevelt was careful not to offend Southern white politicians whose political support he needed, so he didn't push for a bill against lynching. So blacks, Mexicans, Asians, and whites were segregated in the armed forces, and black workers were discriminated against in getting jobs. People who were of color were the last hired and the first fired. So in the 1930s, it was a struggle by people of color to gain admission into both unions as well as larger society, the institutions of larger society. Then there's this one man named A. Philip Randolph. He was the head of the Sleeping Car Porters Union, a socialist. He threatened a massive march on Washington in 1941, and only when Roosevelt agreed to sign an executive order establishing a Fair Employment Practices Committee was the march called off. Now, the Fair Employment Practices Committee laid the foundation for the civil rights movement that would emerge a few years later. So let's go to a brief bio on A. Philip Randolph and appreciate his importance to the black community.
I think one of the individuals that in some ways encapsulates as much of the full range of political organizing in Harlem over many decades of the 20th century would be A. Philip Randolph. Here's a man who comes into the fullness of his calling first as a socialist. He is the co-editor of a magazine called The Messenger, advocating for taking down capitalism as really the only true road to racial equality, which eventually leads him to union organizing. And so he founds the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters and Maids. The and maids gets dropped off over time, but initially it really was a mass labor movement organized around increasing wages and benefits for black porters and maids on Pullman cars, which traveled all around the country. A. Philip Randolph also is the broker of the March on Washington movement, which is a threat posed to Franklin Delano Roosevelt to integrate the defense industries that were taking advantage of black migrants coming out of the South in response to the opportunities of World War II. And so with the threat of 100,000 black people marching on Washington in 1941, Franklin Delano Roosevelt preemptively signs Executive Order 8802, the Fair Employment Practices Commission. Randolph eventually supports Martin Luther King, the young Baptist preacher in the mid-1950s, and ultimately leads to being the lead planner of the March on Washington in 1963. A. Philip Randolph even lived long enough to witness the influence of Malcolm X on this community. So if you just take A. Philip Randolph, that one life rooted here in this community, in all the different philosophies and ideological approaches that he took in trying to move the needle on civil rights in this country, you get a wonderful sense of the richness of ideas that were in circulation.
All right, so A. Philip Randolph, he's going to finally realize his dream of the March on Washington in 1963. It's going to catapult Martin Luther King into prominence. But again, let's appreciate this generation. What is important for us is how the Committee of Industrial Organizations became the Congress of Industrial Organizations. Now, the CIO was born out of a fundamental dispute within the U.S. labor movement over whether and how to organize immigrant workers. And those who favored craft unionisms believed that the most effective way to represent workers was to defend the advantages that they had secured through their skills. Craft unionists were opposed to organizing workers on an industrial basis. So let's appreciate again the American Federation of Labor leadership treated the CIO, the Committee on Industrial Organizations, as an enemy from the outset, refusing to deal with it and demanding that it dissolve. And primarily is because the CIO reached out to the immigrant. The CIO reached out to the industrial worker, the unskilled worker. The AFL-CIO's opposition to the CIO, however, only increased the stature of the CIO and John Lewis of the United Mine Workers in the eyes of those industrial workers who were keen on organizing and were disillusioned by the American Federation of Labor's ineffective performance. Now, Lewis continued to denounce the AFL-CIO's policies while the CIO offered organizing support to workers in the rubber industry who went out on strike and formed the Steelworkers Organizing Committee. And they did that in defiance of all of the craft divisions that the AFL had required in past organizing efforts in 1936. So, students, the first major industrial revolution to be chartered by the CIO on November 16, 1938, was the United Electrical, Radio, and Machine Workers of America, also called the UE. And the UE today is one of the most important and strongest unions in the telecommunications industry. The subsequent explosive growth of the UE was instrumental for the survival in the early days of the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations. Then the sit-down strikes and the Memorial Day massacres led to the popularity of the CIO. But the CIO was very, very important because it represented previously excluded groups. Now people of color and women are going to join in mass. Blacks, immigrants, Mexicans, and women. So, without the rank and file disruption and the eventual organizing tactics institutionalized by the CIO, we would not have what is known as the Fair Labor Standards Act today. And the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 is a federal statute of the United States. And the Fair Labor Standards Act established a national minimum wage. It guaranteed time and a half for overtime in certain jobs, and it prohibited most employment of minors in oppressive child labor. This was a term that is defined in the statute. And it applies to employees that are employees who are engaged in interstate commerce or are employed by an enterprise engaged in commerce or in the production of goods for commerce, unless the employer can claim an exemption from coverage. But basically what the Fair Labor Standards Act, the ultimate message to the working American, to the immigrant worker, to the first generation of immigrants, the ultimate message is it's not your fault that you are poor. But on May 26, 1938, a committee is going to be formed that was established as a special investigating committee. It will be known as the House Committee on Un-American Activities. It was reorganized from its previous incarnations as the Fish Committee and the McCormick-Dickstein Committee, but it was designed, the House Un-American Activities Committee, HUAC, to investigate allegedly disloyalty and subversive activities on the part of private citizens, public employees, and those organizations suspected of having communist or fascist ties. And this committee is very important because it was in response to events that were occurring in Europe. And the committee would work for the next 20 years to undermine the organizing activities of union leaders, of immigrants, of workers, of immigrant workers, and they would work to deport some American citizens whose loyalty was called into question. This particular committee eventually is going to influence the passage of what will be known as the Smith Act of 1940. And the committee's importance was reinforced by the passage of the Smith Act. And the Alien Registration Act, or Smith Act of 1940, is a United States federal statute that set criminal penalties for advocating the overthrow of the U.S. government and required all non-citizen adult residents to register with the government. The act is best known for its use against political organizations and figures, with approximately 215 Americans indicted under the terms of the legislation, including alleged communists, Trotskyists, and fascists. Luisa Moreno, whom we just covered previously, as an immigrant Guatemalan woman, worker, she will be deported under the provisions of this act. So, students, I have shared with you that this particular presentation would cover the Bracero program and into World War II. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and save World War II so that I don't rush through it in the next presentation. I will just call this presentation the Great Depression and the 1930s, and we'll leave it with that. And I'd like to end this particular session, and next week we will pick up with the Bracero program and World War II.